This is the Comics Alternative on location at HeroesCon 2018, the Between Pen and Pixel panel. Hello and welcome to another episode of the Comics Alternative on location. I'm Derek, and this is the second of 3 episodes that I recorded while at HeroesCon 2018 this past weekend. And on this episode, you're going to hear a recording of a panel that I was a member of, Between Pen and Pixel. But before we get to that, I want to let all of you know that this episode of the Comics Alternative on location is brought to you by those wonderful folks at Discount Comic Book Service. Go to their website, dcbservice.com, for all of your comics pre-ordering needs. There, you're going to find all DC, Marvel, Image, and Dark Horse titles at 40% off of the cover price if you pre-order. For all of the other publishers, you'll find that those discounts will be anywhere from 20 to 35% off of the cover price. And every single month, you're going to find some incredible specials. Sometimes those specials could be as much as 45% off of the cover price. Sometimes 50% off cover. But every now and again, you can find discounts that are even more impressive than that. And if you go to DCB Service right now, you'll find, as usual, incredible savings on a variety of comics, including bundles of titles from such publishers as DC, Marvel, and Valiant. And this month, you'll also find 2 notable bundles, both from DC, and these include the Jinx World bundle, which you can get at 50% off of the cover price, and then there's the Sandman Universe bundle at 45% off of the cover price. Whichever way you dice it, you really can't beat the great prices at Discount Comic Book Service. Go to dcbservice.com right now for all of your comics pre-ordering needs. And after you do get your titles there, please be sure to send them an email and tell them that the 2 guys with PhDs sent you. This past weekend at HeroesCon 2018, I had the pleasure of being a member of the panel Between Pen and Pixel. It's all about the unsteady and even complementary relationship between print and digital text. And in fact, this panel's topic was based on the work of Aaron Kashtan. And to help set a context for this panel, I have the pleasure of talking with Aaron right now. How you doing, Aaron?
I'm good, thank you. How are you?
I'm doing well. And first and foremost, I had a really good time on your panel this weekend. Thank you for pulling it together.
Oh, good. I'm glad you enjoyed it.
I think it turned out really well, and I think our listeners will get a lot from our discussion. Now, as a way of setting some kind of context, I know you did this somewhat on the panel, and it's in the recording. But now you have an opportunity to, I guess, expand upon your book, what it's all about, and how you were able to translate what you're doing in your recently published book into this HeroesCon panel. So why don't you introduce your text and the panel?
Okay, so the book is called Between Pen and Pixel, Comics Materiality and the Book of the Future, and it was published a couple months ago by Ohio State University Press. So the book is inspired by the current debate about the book, about the future of the book, like what's going to happen to printed books in an age of digital technology. Is the book going to disappear, or can printed books and digital books coexist? Because there's a lot of somewhat overblown fears the books are dying because people don't read anymore. We'd all rather tweet or watch TV or whatever. Because bookstores are closing and Amazon is taking everything over. Those things are not necessarily true, but they're widely perceived as being true. So the book responds to those fears, and it says that our understanding of the debate about the future of the book has been somewhat confused by the fact that these discussions of this topic mostly focus on printed books. And when you read a printed book, you don't necessarily perceive how the experience of reading the book is affected by its physical properties, because the actual text of the book is the same whether you're reading it on a screen or whether you're reading a paper copy. Whereas with comics, it's really obvious how the physical properties of the text influence your ability to understand it. When you read comics, you're aware of the materiality of the text in a way that you might not be when reading a printed book. So in the book, I discussed this by examining the work of a number of cartoonists, including Matt Kindt, who was on the panel, Linda Berry, Carla Speed McNeil, Chris Ware, Jason Shiga. I discuss comics that were designed for the print medium and that specifically take advantage of the unique properties of print. I discuss comics that take advantage of specific material properties of digital media, and then comics that move from one to the other, or that are meant to be read on both in digital form and in print together, where the two create a complementary experience. And did you want me to also introduce the people on the panel?
Sure, yeah. Now, I've already mentioned that I was a member of the panel. Obviously, you were, but who else?
So the panel also included Matt Kindt, who is the creator of the comic series Mind Management, which I discuss on the panel, and also other works like Red-Handed and Super Spy that also take advantage of the unique properties of print. And it was nice to have him on the panel because he can provide sort of a creator's perspective on what sort of creative decisions does he have to make when working in this environment where print and digital coexist. The panel also included two other comic scholars besides myself and Derek, Andy Kunka, who is a professor at USC Sumter, and University of South Carolina Sumter, and Craig Fischer, who is a professor at Appalachian State University.
Yeah, we had a really good lineup, and I think it was a fun conversation, very productive and insightful. So thank you very much for the context for this really thorough setup. Let's go ahead and listen to that panel now.
So this panel is inspired by my new book, Between Pen and Pixel, Comics, Materiality, and the Book of the Future, which was just published a couple months ago by Ohio State University Press. And the point of this book is to discuss what comics can tell us about the ongoing debate about the future of the book. Because there's all of these overblown fears that in the age of Amazon and Twitter and iPads, print is becoming obsolete. Bookstores are closing, sales of print books are dropping, people don't read anymore, and no one can read lengthy text because we'd all rather tweet or watch videos. Now, those claims are not necessarily those claims are not necessarily factually true, but they are widely perceived as being true. And like The Onion even did an article that was like print dead at 1803 years or something like that. That was kind of a satirical obituary for the death of print. Now, the trouble is that if we're just looking at printed texts as literary critics and journalists usually do when they discuss this topic, it's not always clear why this matters. With a printed text, with a traditional novel, the substance of the text is the same whether you're reading it as a printed book or as a digital text. It's not clear why Moby Dick is any different when you read it in print or in digital form. Now, there are an increasing number of books that do take advantage of print technology to do things that would not be possible in a digital text, like Mark Danielewski's House of Leaves, for example, but those are still very much the exception, and most books offer fundamentally the same reading experience in print as in digital form. At least it initially seems that way, and you may not notice the differences. So this is why comics are especially important for rethinking the future of the book, because comics don't offer the same reading experience when you read them in print as when you read them digitally, and all of us in this room know that, because as comic scholars, as comics fans or creators or scholars, we understand that why print comics and hardcover collections and digital comics do not offer the same reading experiences. And that's why I personally just spent $5 on this, even though I've already read the story at least once. And 2 floors down from here, people are spending vast amounts of money on comics that they could probably download and read for free if they wanted. Because we know, and the reason for this is because we know that printed artifacts have a value which is not reducible to the information in them. we know that comics don't look and read the same way on a screen as they do on paper. And I'm not saying that digital comics are inherently worse, just that these are two different reading experiences which cannot necessarily be substituted for each other. Thank you. Okay. Bear with me for a second.
There it goes. Bingo, bingo.
Can we actually see this yet?
Yeah, we can.
Yep. Okay, so here's House of Leaves. This is an example of a book that does take advantage of the unique affordances of print, the unique things that print can do that digital technologies can't. Okay, and comics are also pretty good at taking advantage of the things that you can only do in print. Like, here is a 4-page spread from one of Matt's mind management graphic novels, and that's Andy's thumb at the upper right, and Andy took this photo for me. So
I had to do a panoramic for that.
So, and I'm glad that Matt is here with us, because Matt is an example of I discussed Matt's work in my book, and he's an example of a cartoonist whose work does unique things with a medium that would be difficult to replicate in a digital text. Oh, and here are examples of the same X-Men comics, but in multiple different formats that don't exactly offer the same reading experiences. And then here's the and the difference is a lot more clear than in the case of a text like A Tale of Two Cities. And then here's the print data 1803 article. So I'd like to begin by asking, and then this is the book, if any of you are interested, you can order this from, I'm sorry I don't have any copies here to sell, but you can order this from the Ohio State University Press website. So I'd like to begin by asking each of the panelists, what's your personal take on this question of the relationship between print and digital, and what comics tell us about it? Should we begin on this side or on that side?
Okay, yeah, I'll start with this. I'll just say, from a creator standpoint, when I approach any project, I take into account the medium that I'm working in. And I think there's multiple levels to that. I think on one level, when I was in school, I was deciding what to do with my life. I'm like, well, I really want to make movies. And I wanted to go to film school, except then I realized you had to work with so many people. And I didn't want to talk to strangers, like a lot of comic artists. And so I decided, you know what, I can tell the same stories, but I can do it in comics, and I can do it all by myself, and I don't have to talk to anybody. That's not necessarily true, because you have to talk to editors and publishers eventually. But so from the beginning, I was trying to figure out what medium I wanted to tell certain kinds of stories, but I was basically just picking a medium that suited my personality. And I gravitated towards comics because I read them when I was growing up. And I love prose, I love comics, I love movies. But I love to draw, I love to write, and it was the one thing that combined both of those. And then as I got older, I went through various stages and different art styles and different thoughts on comics. And eventually, when I realized I was going to do comics for a career, I was like, wow, I don't want to just do superhero comics. I don't want to just do like regular monthly comics. I want to do, I felt like comics was a medium that had so much more to offer. It had a lot of possibilities that hadn't really been explored yet. And I was reading like Chris Ware and Dan Clowes when I was in college. And they just blew it wide open and showed, here's just a couple things you can do, and what comics can do. And I think that's sort of where I came from, where I'm like, okay, I'm not just settling for comics because because I'm antisocial and don't like people. I like some people. But really, I think comics was an unexplored medium, even more than prose, because prose, there's been so many great works that have already been written. I felt like, it's hard to make a dent in that. I could run against that my whole life and not make a dent in prose. But with comics, I felt like it was such a new medium, you could do a lot. And so then I did a bunch of different books. Every book I've done has been in some way trying to figure out a way to do something in comics you couldn't do any other way. This is before, the internet was just starting. There weren't really web comics yet. And I remember, Scott McCloud coming out with books and writing about, all the possibilities of webcomics, and you could have a strip that just scrolled forever and could be unlimited, and I was like, well, that's fun, but I still like books. But the more the internet has taken over, and the more that people read webcomics and read things on their phones and on iPads and that kind of thing, it's made me really re-examine, the medium I'm choosing and the format that it's being produced in. And I went to fine art school, so I was like, well, there needs to be a reason. The vessel that carries the message needs to be a reason for that vessel to be what it is, and if it could be in any format, then I feel like there's something less about that. If it could just be on your phone or on an iPad or on the screen or in a book, that's okay, but to me, you're losing something, So, I think mind management was the first, thing I'd done where I was like, well, no one's really done this before. And I'd been trying to do that with all my books up until that point. But that was the first one where I was like, I'm going to do a monthly comic because I grew up reading that format. And it's kind of an outdated format. I love it for the nostalgia that it brings to me. But I realized if I'm going to do a format like that, there needs to be a reason for it. And so then I decided I was going to play with not just like the big 4-page fold out, in one of the issues, but also have the advertisements on the back covers. Were going to be fake ads that tied into the story. The inside covers had other little stories, and then the pages on you'll never be able to see it from there. But every single page has little side text on it that looks like, you kind of miss it at first. But every page of the story also has a side text that if you read it separately adds to the meaning of the book and the meaning of the stories and the meaning of what's happening on that particular page. So I was trying to use every single inch of the page of the comic, to tell the story and sort of entertain the reader and give you something, to look at that would make you feel like you're part of the story. The concept of mind management is these spies with mind powers and they get recruited, and the conceit of the text on the edges and of the whole series really is this, the series is recruiting you as a reader to become involved in this agency, this mind management agency that, sort of influences history and changes the course of events. So that was the idea, is that every month you're getting this little pamphlet that isn't just a comic, it's a recruitment device for you. It's managing your mind, or are you managing it, or are you just reading a comic, and sort of just kind of bringing the reader into it. And it's a thing that you can read it on the iPad, you can read it, even the hardcovers, they don't have the ads that were on the back of the monthly issues. So every format is a little bit different, and it's a different experience. So if you've read it in a hardcover, it's different than the person that read it every month, with the ads and all the extra stuff inside. And if you're reading it on the iPad, it's similar to the hardcover books. But there's actually pages that I've designed that work, with the transparency of the actual page. And there's other books I've done this in where if you hold a book Super Spy, where you hold the book up to light, and the art behind the page you're looking at works with the art in front of it. There's a cover that does that, and then there's some secret messages that show up if you do that. And I did another book, Red Handed, where unless you buy the book from me, this doesn't happen, but I burn a corner of the page, so the corner burns off, and then the page behind it shows through and works in a different way. So it works as you read it. When you flip it, it sort of changes the meaning of what was behind it, and that's, to me, I feel like the more the internet and digital media takes over, the more I feel like I want to do normal books with paper that you hold, but make it be a reason for you to do it, make it be like an experience rather than just a thing you're consuming. It's a thing you're experiencing.
Now, Andy, you said that I know that you gave a paper which about Red Handed, didn't you?
Yeah, and it was called "Why Did Matt Kindt Light My Book on Fire?" but it dealt with a lot of the things you're dealing with in between pen and pixel, Aaron. That there is there's a materiality to that, but there's also an experience tied to it. As the reader, you get this, everybody ends up with like a unique book then, right? Even though it's burnt and you get kind of the same image revealed, it's not always burnt in the same way. And I mean, if I could ask a question about that sort of thing, that seems tied very much into the conference or the convention experience. Are there other things that you do to kind of make unique reading experiences for readers who come to you at the convention and get stuff from you?
Yeah, honestly, that idea was born out of just being bored at conventions of doing the same thing. Because I love conventions and it's fun and people are so nice. But after a while, it's just you're signing your name over and over. I wanted to do something different, so I went to art school and I took a class in art school. It was foundations and half of it was performance art. And it was the worst. I hated it. I was like, what? I'm never going to use performance art. It doesn't tie into anything I want to do, which is just comics, and I want to paint, I want to draw, but performance art, no way. But then, a few years ago, I was at a convention. I'm like, wow, I'm really bored here. I want to do something, but I'm kind of shy. I'm not a performer at all. But I was like, you know what if I did something with a book that's more interactive and just allows me to do something that is nutty. So I honestly, I burned that corner of that book. And then there's a book called The Tooth I did where there's like an ad inside of it that mimics the old ads when I was a kid where you draw the turtle or the pirate. It's like an art test and you mail it in. And then I don't know what would happen if you were, it was like a correspondence course kind of art class. So I'm sure that everybody got accepted into it. So I did an ad that was like that with a pirate on it, and I left a blank spot for the person who has a book. They could draw in their own thing. But at conventions, I sign that part of it. I draw in it, and then I actually cut it out, and then glue that into the front as like the book plate in the front. Which is, I mean, and then again, it works like red-handed where the panel behind it then mirrors that profile, the pirate profile on the other side of the page. So it sort of interacts. But yeah, there's no way to do that anyway, but in a book. I don't know. And a lot of it is boredom. Some of it's just an idea I have waiting for a story that it goes with, So.
Didn't you have pills with,
yeah.
Was it with Super Spy or?
Yeah, Super Spy. Super Spy had a little cyanide breath mints. There was this they were Tic Tacs. It was just a way to do something. But
you'll never have to worry about
to that. Going back to Super Spy, I did that as a webcomic first. So it's a graphic novel. But I did it 8 pages a week for a year. And I posted them one tier at a time. So the page was 3 tiers. And I would do 1 tier at a time, which sometimes was 1 panel, sometimes it was 2 or 3. And I would do 8 pages a week and post those on a Monday. But it would be 1 tier at a time. And the beauty of that was you could click through and you would click and it would be panel every time you clicked. And I actually formatted to fit the PlayStation Portable little game device, which the only reason I did it was so I could justify getting a little game machine. But it dictated the size of my proportion of my panels, which is crazy from a creative. I mean, how stupid is that? To like I'm going to let this game machine dictate my format. But the side effect of that was, as I was doing it, and you click through this, or you're on the screen clicking through it, I realized that you could have like effects with it, like limited animation. So you'd have a guy walk across the room. In the book, he's here, then he's here, then he's here. But when you're clicking online, it's like click, click, click. You watch him walk across the room. Or you can have a scene where you're outside a building, and then the next panel you're a little closer, the next panel you're inside the window. But when you're reading it online or on this little PlayStation thing, it feels like you're moving into it. So it's almost like a limited animation thing that you could do. And you could click back and forth, and it would give you like sort of weird effects. So I would do it with the intent that it would work online like that, knowing that the book, it wouldn't work the same. So I feel like as much as I like exploiting books, I think there's so much you can do with digital media that you can exploit that as well without it being animation. It's still comics to me. It's not sound effects or anything moving without you doing it. You're still interacting by clicking on it. I think it goes both ways with the media.
So, and just in response to your point about the shape of the panels being dictated by the shape of the device, that's a point that I discussed in the book with regard to Comixology, how Comixology has this guided view app where you see one panel at a time, and it works a lot better with panels that are square or rectangular that are the same shape as the tablet or the phone that you're viewing it on, and it doesn't work quite as well with panels that have jagged or diagonal or curved borders. But I want to hear a bit from Derek and Craig.
Yeah, if I could. Oh, I'm sorry, Derek.
No, I was going to play off of a reference that you just made, and that was to Comixology. And one of the things that, first and foremost, I'm with you, Matt, in that I prefer the print version, and whenever I can get my hands on a print version of a comic, graphic novel, whatever you want to call them, that's what I'll read. But every now and again, I will read digital versions of those books for any number of reasons. One of the things that I think digital brings that I get excited about, or not excited, but I appreciate, I guess, and that is the manipulability of the text, right? Now, playing off of, Aaron, what you had just mentioned about Comixology, I hate the guided view. If I'm going to manipulate a text, then I don't want another program or another entity to do so. As I get older, especially toward the end of the day, I find that my eyes aren't what they used to be. And so one of the great things about a digital manuscript is that I can zoom in without having to hold the device, the tablet, close to me, which is what I would do if I had a physical copy of the book. Now, holding a copy of the book close to me is not the worst thing in the world, but there's something kind of nice about being able to manipulate a text, making it larger, making it smaller, scrolling in whatever ways that I want. So that's one of the benefits of digital manuscripts that I really appreciate. My experience, though, with digital comics is not so much, I guess, with digital comics. In other words, comics that basically the digital component is the exact same thing as the physical copy. It's webcomics. And I know that many webcomics are eventually published in book form. In fact, many webcomics, as Matt was suggesting, are produced with ultimately a print copy in mind.
This is something else I discussed in the book, by the way.
Yes, but there are nonetheless a number of webcomics that will never find print. I enjoy webcomics. I appreciate webcomics. And one of the things I think that webcomics brings that other formats, including not only print, but also digital versions of print, do not, is the democratization. Anyone can create a webcomic. Basically a webcomic for all practical purposes is nothing more than a visual blog when it comes right down to it. Just as anyone can come up with a blog, anyone can come up with a webcomic. Now, you're going to come up with a lot of dreck, but at the same time, there's going to be a lot of possibility, and you may find a lot of talent that wouldn't find its way in print for whatever reason, expressing itself through a webcomic. And so that's one of the things, at least from my experience in terms of digital formatting of comics, is where the real joy lies.
Craig?
Yeah, I wanted to follow up on a question, and I agree with everything that Derek just said about the democratization of webcomics. I think it's great that people can do the work, and of course, the work stands or falls on its own merit once it's able to reach an audience. But I wanted to follow up a little bit more on what Matt was talking about and also what Aaron talks about in the book, which is this notion of materiality and what its relationship is to storytelling. I come from a film studies background, although I also write about comics. And in film, there seems to be this kind of antagonistic relationship between an audience's immersion in a story and their awareness of the materiality of the medium. It's like the difference between going to see a movie and going, wow, I'm really falling into the story and connecting with the story, versus, wow, I know the film stock that's being used and look at the grain of the 35 millimeter or something. It's two different ways of watching, but usually if we're pulled out of the story, we're paying attention to the materiality. And if we ignore the materiality and fall into the story, then it's kind of like an either or kind of thing. So my question is, first to Matt, have you ever found that doing those additional things to the graphic novels that you do, the marginalia in mind management, let's say, or whatever. Are you ever afraid that that's going to interrupt the audience's experience of the main story as a kind of digression or diversion away from the kind of effect that you want to have on them as they read, the kind of absorption they have in the story? Or
yeah, I mean, I do. I think I have a lot of readers come up and they ask me, which way do I read it? Do I read the text on the side first? Do I read and then read the page? Do I read the whole thing and then do I read the side text? I'm like, to me, my work, I feel like is a little bit of a puzzle, and I want people I expect people to work a little bit for it, you know, and I feel like I'm trying to give the reader as much credit as possible to figure it out, you know, and to me, the formal presentation of the story is as important as the story, you know, and I don't think it's more important or less important. I think that the story dictates the format, you know, and I think that the nature of this story dictated a lot of the things I did in there, which are distracting or could be distracting, but it's a balance of trying to make it subtle. So I've had readers come up and be like, I didn't even notice the text till I was done. And then they go back. I'm like, perfect. You know, ideally that's what it would be for me, because it is the story first. Read the story, then go back and read the text, you know, and part of it to me is an economy thing, is comics are expensive. I as a reader, I'm just trying to make a comic I would like to read. And the catch-22 is by the time I'm done with it, I'm so sick of it, I never want to look at it again. But I'm trying to make something I would want to read, and what I don't like is paying $5 for 22 pages that I read in 5 minutes. That you read in 5 minutes. Yeah, and I feel like in a world that is full of like amazing movies and books and everything else that, you know, that is immersive for hours, you know, and costs the same. Comics are a disadvantage, you know, unless you can do something to add value or make that experience more
or
immersive.
Enhance its rereadability, right?
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, and I think a lot of that pushes me to write stories that are not just with the bells and whistles, like gimmicky stuff, but to write stories that are harder or more challenging. So you need to go read it again. You know, you get to the ending and maybe feel like you did miss something. You know, like my favorite books are that. You know. Like Pale Fire is one of my favorite novels, or poems, whatever it is.
Footnotes.
It's amazing because I can imagine him at a convention signing books and people asking, how do I read it?
Can you briefly explain what this book is in case anyone doesn't know?
Oh, Pale Fire is by Nabokov, and it's a poem, and in the back of the book is annotations for the poem, which also I'm describing it terribly, but annotations for the poem that go line by line, and then somewhere between that is a story. There's a narrative.
The big problem is the guy who's doing the annotations. A footnote on the 55-page poem is insane.
Yeah, right. He's a psychopathic stalker. But
he thinks he's the king of a country called Zembla.
Yeah, but that's the beauty of it. That book is like, how do you read it? I don't know. That book is an experience, and reading that book digitally. I don't know how it would be kind of hard, I think, because you have to go back and forth or go to the beginning and then the end. I don't know. I just feel like, but on the flip side, I think digital media, you know, there's so many things that I'm not even scratching the surface on because I still like books, you know. But I do, I got an iWatch, and the first thing I thought of was like, I want to do a comic that is formatted this, and then you scroll through and then do tiny panels, but then it's formatted only for a watch.
I could have sworn someone did do that.
Did they?
Aaron, I wanted to ask a follow-up question, sort of riffing off what we asked Matt, which is that in your book, it doesn't seem like you place storytelling and materiality in that kind of antagonistic relationship that we do in film studies and in other disciplines. That is, for you, the materiality is something you simply can't ignore when you read a comic, is what you argue in your book. What do you think the relationship is then? Does that materiality, the fact that you're holding a comic and the comic has a feel and the comic has a smell, is that any sort of distraction from the experience of being as absorbed in comics as you would be in, let's say, for example, a television show or a film?
Yeah, it's weird. And I mean, and I think I do say briefly in the introduction how there are some kinds of comics that do try to make you forget about materiality, like and one example would be manga, where when you read manga, it's designed to kind of be read very quickly and to be very immersive to the point where you don't necessarily even notice how many pages are going past. Yeah, I'm just remembering. I think Marie-Laure Ryan talks about this opposition between immersion and interactivity, and I haven't read that book in a while, but it's something I don't really talk about very much in the book, but it is potentially a problem that it's difficult to be absorbed in the book at the same time as you're noticing the materiality. I do think that this maybe is something that we as comics readers kind of train ourselves to do, because when we read a comic that has a great story and great art, we kind of find ourselves being immersed in the story at the same time as we're noticing how great the art is. But then maybe we get a bit more immersed as we read more and get used to the art style. So it's something I don't really consider in the book, and it is an interesting question.
Yeah, I remember when I read that in the book, especially about the manga. I mean, and then you just said something about how we're trained as readers. I not really took issue with the manga thing, but because didn't grow up with manga and not used to it, I can't help but feel the materiality of it, because I'm always instinctively going from left to right on a page rather than from right to left and have to start over again. But I think so it would take some training for me to get immersed in manga.
Yeah.
Well, and that brings in the issue of audience. And, my experience is similar to Andy's in that, I've been reading manga for quite a number of years. I'm still in the process of introducing myself to manga, but even though I am used to the right to left reading now, to the point that I swear to you, the other day after reading manga for a couple of hours, I picked up an English language text. I started on the right side, unfortunately. Even to Western eyes, even if you've been used to manga for so many years reading it, it's a different kind of experience. And not just the left to right part, but the style, the bleed, the action lines. It's something that we're really not used to. So my experience in getting lost and forgetting the materiality of the text, of a manga text, is going to be very different from that of an Asian reader, or a Japanese reader, someone who grew up in that medium.
Yeah, or a 12-year-old today.
Or a 12-year-old today, yeah, exactly.
Or our kids, that's right.
So I guess to that degree, when I read that point of your book, I did take about manga. I did take a little issue just because of my own personal experiences with manga.
Yeah, I can vouch for the fact that Derek is on volume 18 of 20th Century Boys. Is that right? 19. Okay.
Yeah, and this is a debate I've had before about how aware we are of materiality when reading comics. I think partly. I make the claim in the book that in comics we tend to be more aware of materiality than when we're reading a prose book, and it's been pointed. I think Corey Creekmer pointed out that this could be because comics are just a more familiar medium to. That prose is just a more familiar medium than comics, and that this helps explain why we have this instinctive familiarity with prose that we don't have with comics. I also wanted to mention that this kind of goes back to an earlier point. When I read mind management, I tend to when I was reading mind management, I tend to turn my head to the left like this to read the text on the inside of each page, and then when I read the first issue that didn't have any of the text, any of the horizontal text on the inner margin, I felt like I was missing something. I kept wanting to turn my head to the left.
Yeah, I have to physically move the book. I can't turn my head. Plus, I also have to drop my glasses down and hold it really close to my face. So I know when I was just binging mind management in preparation for this, and I know my wife thought it was weird how I was reading the book to spin it around. I also wanted to add an anecdote that doesn't have anything to do with anything, but that that Matt talked about the book being kind of recruiting you into being a member of mind management. after reading, all 36 issues in one sitting. I had a dream that night that somebody walked up to me and said, "You're having a heart attack," and I had a heart attack in the dream. And so
in the dream, only in the dream. Okay.
Yeah, yeah. I didn't wake up.
Yeah.
But that, but I think that does speak to the immersive quality of that book, that you're reading a text that's in the world of the text itself. It's diegetic, and that you're and so that you're a part of the narrative in a sense too.
Yeah.
A similar example would be like Fantastic Four 352, where the story requires you to keep turning the pages back and forth. And there's one point where part of the story actually takes place on the cover. I'm sorry, someone else wanted to say something.
Yeah. There's also, I was thinking of Trillium too, of Jeff Lemire's Trillium. That's a completely different experience reading the individual issues and reading the trade. And I think when we talked to Jeff about it, right, there's one issue that you read across the bottom throughout the whole issue. You flip the comic over and then read across the other direction. And there's several different issues that are like that I think if you're reading them in trade doesn't quite work.
So I want to save a bit of time at the end. I want to save some time at the end for questions, but I do have one more question for the panelists. So what do you think about the economics of print versus digital comics? Like, are comics currently doing a good job of keeping both print and digital alive, and do readers still want to be able to consume media, to consume comic in both these formats, or do you think do you think that either print or digital currently has an economic advantage over the other? Just in general, what are your thoughts on the economics of print versus digital? Anyone want to start?
I'll answer as someone who is in a college town that doesn't have a comic shop, and which is I think it has to do with what kind of format of comics you're talking about. But if you're talking about the traditional 32-page floppy or single or whatever you want to call them, its accessibility has less to do with whether or not people want to read them as to whether or not they have access to them in a place where you don't have a comic shop where they're sold.
Yeah, I think, Aaron, you talk about this a little bit in the book about when you teach comics, what formats your students use. And I have that experience a lot. And this semester, was the first time I've ever just told my students, get a Comixology Unlimited subscription or get a Marvel Unlimited subscription for what we're doing. And largely that was out of necessity. I mean, I have gone several years wanting to teach, for example, I'll teach the first Galactus story in Fantastic Four.
Right.
And then that collection, Marvel doesn't keep that collection in print. So then I switch over to wanting to teach the first year of Spider-Man, and you've got to get the Epic collection that's 16 issues in it, and
it's $40.
Right. And now that's out of print. And so it just, out of necessity, the only way a lot of stuff is staying available anymore is through digital. And like Craig, I teach in a town that doesn't have a comic book store. So, the primary way those students are going to get it and they're going to read it is digitally.
Now, wasn't it you who gave the paper where you discussed at ICAF where you talked about searching quarter boxes as a research methodology or something?
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah. That's something I'd like to do more of, but just, because somebody asked me, I was doing a paper on a weird comic that Dell published, and somebody asked, how did you find this? Or how did you learn to write about this? And I'm like, I just saw a comic that was cool in a $1 box, and I bought it, and then I thought, wow, I can actually do something with this. And I think that, there's a lot of probably comics history that's sitting in those $1 boxes downstairs that could reveal something that we haven't really thought about yet.
Yeah. I'll just add one thing about the digital versus print too, is from markets or financial, whatever standpoint, is that I love the idea that all comics are available all the time, because I think it takes comics away from being like a collector's medium. It's not stamps or coins. You know what I mean? It's an art medium. It's a delivery system for stories and ideas. And so I think the more available it is and the less collectible it is, I think the better it is for the viability of the art form.
Well, Aaron, I have a question because you were asking about the economic issues. Now, I know we have numbers when it comes to sales through the direct market. I know we have numbers when it comes to sales through regular retail. What kind of information, if any, may we have in terms of digital sales? Because from what I gathered, many publishers are rather tight-lipped when it comes to digital.
Yeah, and this is a serious problem. The research project I'm doing now has to do with the diversification of the comics industry. And I think that I've given a paper, if I remember it correctly, the paper I gave at the same conference that where Andy gave the paper I just mentioned, I was saying how there's sort of this false narrative that comics are dying and that because comic book store sales are going down. And the trouble is that this does not, that we don't really have first of all, it ignores comics sold in bookstores, which are really the economic engine of the industry right now. But second, we also don't really know much about how comics are selling digitally and who is buying them. And yeah, publishers are reluctant to release that information. And so even with printed books, you got things like BookScan, which actually do track sales in print stores. But that is a problem we often get in comics journalism, and just stuff people say on Twitter is just like assuming that the direct market is the entire comics industry and just basically ignoring digital sales or webcomics or whatever.
Yeah, and one of the reasons why I'm curious about that is not necessarily to show, see, digital sales aren't eating into print as much as we thought. But I would like for it to be that digital sales may have, let's say, over the past several years, increased to the point that it's bringing in new readers. Mm-hmm. In other words, it's not taking away from print sales. It's adding to an awareness of comics in a larger sense. At least the idealistic part of me would like to think that.
I think there's a lot of anecdotal evidence that there's certain comics, for example, that are staying in print largely because of their digital sales. I mean, I've heard that about like Ms. Marvel, and I've heard that like Moon Girl and Devil Dinosaur sells like crazy.
Although I think that one is, I think that one is largely because of books.
Yeah. But that there's all mainly like what you're saying. There's, you can have a comic book like that sells, like from what we get from the Diamond numbers, sells like 5,000 copies or whatever a month. Mm-hmm. But we have no idea how, and there's kids getting that at Scholastic book sales that, that may not be getting comics otherwise.
Yeah, exactly. And the anecdotal information is one thing. It's just, I would like kind of hard numbers.
Oh, sure. Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah. I get those in my royalty checks, but I get hard numbers. Because they break it out for digital sales versus print, I'm glad it's still in print because I get more money off print than I do digital.
Oh, really?
Still, yeah.
Why do you think that might be?
I don't know. I think only for the Marvel and DC stuff I've done, I think that, most people still, they're collectors. So they want the print, and so it's always going to be digital until people start collecting it.
Well, I think it's great to have, they also, when you talk about the economics, being a researcher, and when I did the paper on Red Handed, Matt, I didn't feel like scanning. I didn't feel like breaking the spine on mind management and scanning it. So I just bought it digitally, took a picture of it, and that saved me so much trouble. So I'm glad. I mean, I own mind management in like 3 different versions, but,
perfect.
But I'm glad
that's my plan.
So this is kind of a trivial example of what's known as digital humanities, like the electronic, the use of electronic methods to study literary texts. So we've got about 15 minutes left. So I was wondering what questions you all had in the audience.
I have a question for Aaron, if I could.
Sure.
If you sit out in the audience.
Yes, that's right. I have to take the microphone out in the audience. One of the things that you say in your book is a kind of like general consensus that seems to be coming together in comic scholarship, which is that comic scholars tend to focus on like the same 10 texts, right? Autobiographical texts that are sold in bookstores, which again, as you say, is such an important economic engine of the industry. But that seems to constitute this kind of informal canon of books, right? People all read Maus, Watchmen, Fun Home, those books. Persepolis. Those are the books that get taught in classrooms and that garner the vast majority of attention. And one of the things I really liked about your book is that, you write about mind management, you write about bad debt, you write about these books that deserve attention but don't get enough attention. Do you think that we as comic academics are letting the medium down by not discussing a larger swath of books, and are we obsessively focusing on this one canon too much?
Yeah, and when I referred to the economic engine of the industry, I was mostly thinking of YA graphic novels, like the work of Raina Telgemeier, especially.
But she's a good example. She sells more books than anyone, and so far, comics academia hasn't caught up with her. She's the influence of this generation in comics, and nobody writes about her.
Yeah.
Okay, you write about everyone.
Oh, you are writing about her?
In autobiographical comics, I talk about her. But I talk about her in the way that Bart Beatty and Benjamin Wu talk about her, which is, first, why isn't anybody talking about her? But also this idea, like, what is the future of comics going to be like with, Raina Telgemeier making up something like 5 to 10% of the comic sales every year? Who are the kids that are reading her now that are going, what are comics going to look like when those kids start making comics?
And is there a kind of, misogynistic snobbery and, we're not going to deal with the YA comics done by this female creator or something? Is that the problem with comics academia, not taking into account what's going on with such a...
Well, yeah, I'll just respond to that, and then I'll let Derek go.
Yeah.
But sorry. Let me go. Yeah.
But, yeah, I mean, this is something I talk about in the beginning of the book, because I think that there is a certain approach to comic studies that says, I'm sorry that this is all sort of inside baseball because the four of us are all comic scholars, but yes, there is sort of this approach that says, like, the way that we're going to justify the study of comics is by showing how comics can be related to, all these other topics that literary texts are already discussing. And I think that that's partly why, Mouse and Persepolis and Fun Home by Art Spiegelman, Marjana Satrapi, and Alison Bechdel, respectively. These have become the center of the academic canon of comics because they're highly relevant to issues that that literary scholars are discussing already. But the thing is that, I'm trying to remember how I phrased this in the book, but, what this sometimes leads to is the idea that only these types of comics are interesting. Like Hilary Shute, who I cite in the book, says at one point that she thinks that women's autobiography is one of the things that comics are best at. And I think that what I try to do in the book is to concentrate on comics as a medium and not so much on specific types of subject matter that are covered in comics. I'm going to take a somewhat different approach in the next book, I think, where I'll be talking more explicitly about issues of diversity and representation. But I think there I'll also be focusing on, like, who is the audience of comics and how are they getting them. So, I'm sorry.
No, because I want to address this question that, Craig raised that you're responding to now. I mean, I agree with you, Aaron, wholeheartedly when it comes to the fact that there seems to be this de facto canon, whether we like it or not, in terms of teaching comics. On the other hand, let's keep in mind, like, who's doing the teaching. So if we, in a very rough way, say we have a community of comic scholars, right, who, to put it bluntly, know better than to use the same quote-unquote literary texts like Mouse and Persepolis and Fun Home over and over and over and over and over again. From my experience, and again, it's anecdotal, it's those who don't know much about, if anything, about comics who teach a particular course on something, and they feel that for whatever reasons they would like to use or maybe need to use a graphic novel, then those are the texts that they gravitate toward because those are the ones that they hear about. Of course they've heard about Mouse. Of course they've heard about Persepolis. And so those are the ones that they're going to use in their classroom. And I think that is probably what propagates this de facto canon.
When I think about this too, I come from a background of doing, my dissertation was in modernist British literature, and I have a background in Joyce a little bit too. And one of the things, to kind of tie back to mind management. Mind management scratches the same itches that I loved about, reading Ulysses or reading James Joyce or these other books, that those books were kind of puzzles to unlock, and there are things that immersed the reader. The reader had such an active role in making meaning out of those books. And that's what I loved about them. And I feel like there's a world of scholars out there that mind management would probably scratch that same itch for, right? I mean, there's just so much richness to it and so much to kind of unpack and say about it. I'm really surprised that there's not more scholarship on it.
I'm still young. It'll happen.
But that raises one other question I had about Department H, since we haven't talked about that. Are there things in Department H that you did that work with these kind of issues of materiality?
Yeah, I did to a lesser degree. Honestly, I was telling somebody earlier today about every book I do is a response to the book I did before. Mm-hmm. So after mind management, I wanted to do something that was not so dense, like simple, more straightforward. That said, there's still stuff. There's like little things, but it's almost more formal things that happen within the story. Other than there's a little water meter on the edge of the pages, which I can't help it. I'm sorry, I just can't help some of the. And that's a total gimmick, but I love the idea of if you face them. If you spine in and look at them, you can see the water level rising through the whole series until the end. It goes to the top. But that's the only like weird gimmick thing. Other than that, it's all formal things that are just within the comic. Like towards the end of the series, there's an issue where the whole place, this is a minor spoiler, but the whole place is finally flooding and they're trying to get out of there. And the panels get smaller. It's 6-panel grid, the whole issue. And the panels just get smaller and smaller. So they start normal. And by the end, the last page, the panels are tiny panels or whatever. It's just all black.
Joe Sacco did a story like that where it was a man who was a story about a Palestinian man who was in an Israeli prison, and as the story went on, the panels got smaller and smaller, kind of mimicking his captivity and confinement, until at the end, the last panel was like half a page when he finally got out. So let me actually ask the audience a quick question. So how do you what are your alls? What are your feelings about this? Like, what are your preferences about print versus digital? Anybody want to comment on that?
I'll answer. Recently, I started reading Gottfridson's Mickey Mouse.
Right. Yeah.
Right. And I started reading it with panel. I've been amazed at the amount of details that I see in that that I do not see in the book format. I have some of the Google as well, and it's that to me. I call Barks, it's the same way. You're seeing things that we don't think we've seen typically when we read it as a comic. And that's giving me a greater appreciation of the digital format.
I'm going to speak to that as a creator. I have a problem with digital view only if the creator didn't design it for digital view. Yeah. Okay. Like if it's.
I think as creators, I'm a creator now.
Yeah.
You need to think about digital.
Yeah, you should.
The days when you can not think about it are gone.
Yeah, no, I agree. I'm for it if you've designed your story to work with it. But I think I wouldn't want my older stuff done that way, because honestly, here's the thing: is I produce the art to be viewed at a certain size, and I know you can even if you put it up here,
even if Andy's
it's only going to work as good as your eyes work. But I don't want you zooming in at 10,000% on an iPad and looking at panels. It's fine if you want to do it. I guess you could get out a
magnifying
glass and look at it. But
another example I discuss in the book is Silver Surfer 11. Does anybody know that issue, the Mobius strip issue? It's an issue of Silver Surfer by Dan Slott and Mike Allred that was meant to, you have to read it once going left to right, and then another time going right to left. The entire comic is like a figure 8 loop. And then when they translated this into digital form on Marvel Unlimited, they really didn't make any effort to replicate the digital functionality, and so you miss a big chunk of the reading experience because it was only created with print in mind. And a counterexample to that they also discuss is Meanwhile by Jason Shiga, which is a choose-your-own-adventure book in comics form where the original book makes this very heavy use of materiality. Like you have to keep turning the pages back and forth and following trails off of the end of one page and onto another. And when he turned this book into an iPod app, an iPad app, he actually worked specifically with an iPad with an accomplished interactive fiction developer to make sure that it would deliver not the same experience, but a comparable experience in digital form, and that it wouldn't just be like an inferior copy. Any other thoughts on this? Anyone else want to discuss their preferences?
Yeah, I've been exclusively digital for a few years, and I prefer it really only for two reasons. I think the color and the clarity is better, and I also like, since I have no interest in comics as a collector, as a reader, I like that I don't have to store all these The interesting thing is there's so much other potential they can get out of digital format, but every time I've seen a comic that does introduce that, I have zero interest. It becomes something else that I still like.
Right. Like a motion comic or something. That's interesting that you should mention about the coloring and things like that, because I'm reminded of a post that went up about 5 years ago that was written by Jim Rugg about how much better the first issue of Hellboy and Hell looked in digital than it did in print. Huh. The blacks were more black, the colors were more vibrant. It was just, he said it was transformative to read it digitally because it looked so much better.
It often does. The one thing that I don't like are older comics that have been in color.
Yeah, like you mentioned how the coloring... Wait, was it you who said the coloring in old comics tend to be much better? Or much worse? Someone just said that. Yeah, but the thing is that old comics were typically created with the intent that they would be colored with a four-color process, right. And that... in very low resolution, and the creators work with that in mind. And that's and I think that's likely the origin of the French, sort of the French national style. One of the national styles of comics in France and Belgium, the clear line, where basically everything is a flat block of color, and it looks sort of like a paint by numbers painting. Yeah. So when you take old comics and then when you take old comics that were intended for this flat four-color process and recolor them digitally, it tends to look really garish and ugly. And I've seen some reprintings of Neil Adams' comics that were bad, that were particularly bad examples of this.
Yeah. Jack Kirby has never looked better than in the original.
Yeah.
Original color.
Yeah, I don't know is it the Adams family that's really messing with those colors, because that's shocking when you see that.
Well, the best thing, there's websites that archive Golden Age comics, and they scan all of the pages in and everything, and then you look on your iPad. It's the best of both worlds because it's really bright, juicy color, but it's still the old printing. That's the way to do it.
those websites, like the Digital Comics Museum, there's all these websites now that collect old public domain Golden Age comics.
Yeah, that's the one I'm talking about. What was the website called?
Digital Comics Museum, I think.
Man, it's so great. I donate to that place.
Yeah. Did you donate last month when they gave you the access to their FTP files? Yeah. So I did that, and then I spent days and days.
Yeah,
you only got 1 month access, and just select all quality comics.
Gosh, I filled up the hard drive.
My hard drive.
I think someone else is exclusively digital.
For that stuff.
There you go.
Okay, other comments or questions from the audience? Okay, so any final thoughts on this topic? What do you all think is going to be the future of comics? Oh, okay. Was there a hand up in the audience? Yes.
Yeah.
All right. So I don't really know how this ties into everything, but when I think about my preference for text, I prefer a real book so I can underline and write notes.
Sure.
I would never dream of doing that in comics.
Yeah.
You don't do that in media. But I still prefer the printed comic book because I don't know, something about it being in my hands makes it feel more like it's in my world.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
Even though I wouldn't dare write.
Yeah. That's a challenge students have too when they take a literature class that has comics, and they're like, I'm used to underlining, what do I do with this? And I pull out, my copy of Watchmen, which is twice as thick as it should be because it's got sticky notes in it.
Yeah. I've got the same thing. Yeah.
and that's, but I also wonder if that's, my kind of, that collector mentality coming in conflict with the academic mentality, right? That to ruin, because I have no problem writing in any other books. In fact, I have like 6 copies of Pride and Prejudice that I don't want to get rid of because each one has different
annotations.
Yeah.
Well, but also it's a matter of practicality, right? Because in a traditional prose text, there's really literally more space to write. Where it's not going to get confusing. You try to write the same amount on a typical comics page, if you can make out what you've written later on, good luck.
One of the things I did want to say about that, though, is that I am fascinated by annotations, if you want to call them that. That sounds fancy, but just sort of notes and scribblings and such that you can find in comics. I love to buy beat up old comics, sometimes coverless, and you discover people will write, their names and like the ads to send away for sea monkeys or something like that. One of my favorite examples of that is in Bart Beatty's book, 12 Cent Archie, where he talks about the fact that this one comic that he bought, it's an academic analysis of every Archie comic that cost 12 cents from 1963 to 1969. It's a great book. It's got 100 chapters in it to read. But anyway, there's one story that he tells in there where he got this one comic that was published by Archie, I believe, in 1966, really cheap. And what happened is that somebody had cut out a coupon to send away for something that had been advertised in the comic, but then she also drew in the page. And she, drew in the picture that was originally in the part that she cut out, and then drew the coupon, and then filled out the coupon in the comic itself as well as cutting it out. And she wrote her name in it. It was like Yasmin Ibrahim. And, his essay in the book ends with, Yasmin, I have your comic. If you read my book, I'll return it to you. And that I find that incredibly touching, because that really speaks to a kind of interaction with the comic that the child had, that the child valued it so much that she wanted to preserve it at least in some way, and yet still wanted to make her mark in it at the same time.
So I think we're almost out of time, right?
I just wanted to mention one quick thing on top of Craig's, because I just bought a comic of this weird Dell comic from a TV series called Camp Run Amok, which nobody remembers. And the cover is a photograph, but it's got a word balloon where the camp director is chastising a camper, and he says, "It was you," and someone wrote, "It was poo." Underneath that, I thought, I'm getting this.
Yeah.
Matt, did you have one last comment?
On poo.
Now that's an academic annotation.
I don't have a better story than that.
Okay, so I'm sorry.
No, that's, you know what? I was going to say one more thing. I was going to say that I think, I read digital and I read hard copy stuff of everything, like books, prose, and comics. I think you do make an unconscious put an unconscious value on the thing you're reading by how you choose to read it. Like, I think if you're reading, for me, when I read digital, I'm like, it's disposable. I'm reading it and then I'll never look at it again. But if I actually choose to pick up a book and it takes up space in where I live, then I'm putting more value on that thing.
It acquires a meaning.
Yeah. And I think that's why there's room for both. There's some things I'll never read again. I'll just buy digital and I don't care. And other books that I want to have, even if I never read it again, I want to have it on the shelf to remind me that I read it.
Okay, so Derek, can you tell us about the podcast?
And this is being recorded for the podcast, at least I hope so. The Comics Alternative Podcast, comicsalternative.com. We basically discuss anything in terms of comics as long as it's not mainstream superhero. Not that there's anything wrong with mainstream superhero, but there are tons of podcasts out there that are devoted to that. We deal with the other stuff. We have a weekly review show that goes up every Wednesday, but we have a variety of monthly series that focus on things like manga, comics for younger readers, web comics, things of that sort. We also have an interview series that goes up, whenever we get an interview. So we produce a lot of shows. Definitely check it out, comicsalternative.com. And thank you for allowing me to plug.
Sure. And this panel will be posted, this recording will hopefully be posted to the blog. When did you say it would be?
Within the next week or two.
Possibly with some additional commentary between myself and Derek.
And we do have an episode too, an interview with Matt.
We have an interview, great interview with Matt.
Where we talk about this.
And a monthly episode at Heroes Aren't Hard to Find comic shop in Charlotte.
Yep, that's
Okay.
right.
And if any of you are interested in exploring these issues further, again, my book is Between Pen and Pixel: Comics, Materiality, and the Book of the Future. Thank you, and it's available from Ohio State University Press. All right, so thank you all for coming, and have a great day.
Thanks.
Thank you.
So there you have it, the panel that Aaron pulled together for HeroesCon this year, Between Pen and Pixel. We had a really good time, and we had some interesting comments and questions from the audience. The audience didn't have their own microphone when they were asking the questions, and so maybe their comments didn't come through. But I hope that you were able to pick up the context of what they were saying, especially for my responses. Again, I want to thank Aaron not only for pulling together the panel, but for coming on the show and helping to set a context. I highly recommend that you get a copy of his book from Ohio State University Press, Between Pen and Pixel. And if you want to find great comics, like some of those that we discussed on the panel, then definitely check out the website of our sponsor, which is Discount Comic Book Service. Remember, go to dcbservice.com because every single month you're going to find some unbelievable specials. That's dcbservice.com. And after you do get your comics there, get in touch with us and let us know what you thought about our shows from HeroesCon 2018. If you go to our website, comicsalternative.com, you'll find that you can leave us a voice message online via SpeakPipe. Or you can call us the old-fashioned way by picking up that phone and dialing 4153-COMICS. That's 415-326-6427. You can also email us. We're 2guys@comicsalternative.com, or you can email me directly. I'm Derek at comicsalternative.com. And you can also find us all over social media. We have accounts on Twitter, Facebook, Tumblr, Instagram, Google+, Goodreads, Pinterest, YouTube, Slack, and Discord. You can subscribe to the podcast through Apple Podcasts. You can stream us on Stitcher. You can also find us on Spotify, on TuneIn, on iHeartRadio, and on Google Play Music. But you can find every single one of our podcast episodes, as well as the reviews and comics-related commentary that we post on our blog, simply by going to our website, comicsalternative.com. We've got more HeroesCon programming in the days to come, so be sure to check back for that. Until then, take care.